Alright, I've officially made it to the end of Chapter 7 in Fire in California's Ecosystems. This whole chapter was about how fire interacts with soil, water, and air. And this last section was all about how fire interacts with air. And I would say this was one of my favorite sections of this chapter just because it reminds me of a lot of the lessons that I've learned in forecasting about how wildfire smoke can lead to poor air quality, which obviously has negative impacts on large amounts of people. But then in some cases, your smoke can actually be beneficial for your wildfire activity. And I'll get into all of that in just a moment. First thing I should say is kind of where the smoke comes from in the first place. Now, obviously, it comes from the fire, but it's due to combustion. You have a lot of vegetation, it's burning, and then if you have a high intensity burn, that smoke is going to lift higher into the atmosphere. Versus if your burn is just kind of smoldering along the ground, maybe it'll fill kind of the floors of your valleys, or you might have some smoke around, it might lift up a little bit and drift with the wind. But it's really those high intensity burns that in some cases can lead to almost what you'd call like a rotating column, where it almost looks like a fire tornado, and sometimes you actually can get fire tornadoes because you have so much rising air. But how that works is you have a lot of heat generated on your fire. This is talking about the high intensity fires. That hot air is now less dense, so it's going to rise up. And then as air at the surface comes in to fill the place of the air that just rose, if it comes in at different speeds, like let's say the air coming in from the south is a little bit faster than the air coming in from the northeast, then that's going to lead to a little bit of a rotation. And then as that column gets stretched out, that rotation is going to start spinning faster, almost like an ice skater when they pull their arms in. So then you can get some little rotation on your smoke column, but then with that high intensity heat being generated and then also the buoyancy that is created, then it's lifted way up into the atmosphere. And this can have some pretty big impacts on your air quality because your winds are typically going to be greater the higher up you go. So the higher the smoke goes, the greater transport of the smoke you can have. Now, you could also view that as a good thing, though, because that means it's going to be dissipated over a much larger area. It'll be less concentrated for one specific area, but it also means more people would be affected. So I guess the question mark there would be, would you rather have a smaller number of people have very hazardous air or a massive number of people have unhealthy air? So I don't really know the answer to that question. I'm sure it just depends on a case-by-case basis. So that's how the smoke is generated. And I kind of already tapped into how the smoke is then transported. It's typically by your winds. If you have a wind coming from the northeast, that's going to transport your smoke down to the southwest. And what I've noticed a lot as a forecaster, I talked about how when the fire is very intense in the afternoons, you have a lot of rising motion and the smoke goes very high up in the atmosphere. A lot of times that won't actually be when your air quality is the worst. Your air quality and where you can have some bad or unhealthy effects for humans, I often notice is more as you get later into the evening and then into the early morning hours, because that's when your winds calm down. So then instead of that smoke traveling up in the atmosphere and being dissipated over large distances and basically just moving horizontally, as the winds calm down, as you get into the late evening, through the night and into the morning, then the smoke settles down to the surface. And then obviously that's where all the people are. So if we start breathing it, then that leads to the health effects that you can get from the smoke. And there's lots of different pollutants that you find in smoke. The list in this section of the textbook that I was reading, it reminded me a lot of the air pollution class that I took at Cal Poly. It seemed like they basically just named every air pollutant that you could have in wildfire smoke. There's carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, VOCs, nitrogen oxides, methane, particulate matter. You pretty much name it, you could have that in your wildfire smoke. And one other thing that I've heard is when structures are burned, you think about the chemicals that you might have around your house, like your laundry detergent or, I don't know, all kinds of maybe plastics that you have in your home. Then once that gets in the air, obviously that wouldn't be good for humans to breathe either. So just to wrap that up, during the overnight hours is often when that smoke can settle down to the surface. That can be your most unhealthy air. And then in the afternoons as winds pick up, sometimes it can actually just kind of push the smoke around or dilute it a bit. But you're also going to have worse smoke usually if you're in valleys, because that's where you can get what's called an inversion. So during the daytime, you'll maybe have more smoke being produced if you have some hillsides, because your hillsides heat up more than the valley below. So you get rising air on your hillsides that leads to air rushing up your hill slopes. And then that can push fire very rapidly uphill, leads to more extreme wildfire activity. And then if you have a bunch of vegetation on your hill, obviously with combustion, that's going to lead to your smoke. And you can have a lot of smoke being produced during the afternoon hours. And then what happens is this process reverses overnight. Instead of your winds going uphill, they start going downhill. The reason for that is your hillsides are now going to start cooling off very quickly overnight, and then that cold air is going to be less dense, and it's going to want to settle down into the valley bottom. And then as it's moving downhill, it might be able to take some of the smoke with it. So then you can end up with a lot of smoke on your valley bottom. And then this can also create what's called an inversion, where all the cold air sinks down below, that's more dense. And then you have what's called a thermal belt on top of that. And that's called an inversion because normally your air temperatures get colder as you go up. But then in this case, you have cold air below warm air. You have more dense air below less dense air. So the atmosphere doesn't want to move very much. So what I was talking about earlier, how your winds can actually be beneficial for clearing some of the smoke out, the opposite happens when you have an inversion. Since the atmosphere is kind of exactly how it wants to be, more dense on the bottom, less dense on top, there's not a lot of movement in the air. So then that can lead to your smoke just sitting there, really bad, hazardous air quality conditions. On the flip side, or if you want to talk about some silver lining, I have also seen this be beneficial for wildfire activity. So smoke inversion, maybe not great for air quality and the impacts that that can have on human health. Potentially beneficial in terms of how much smoke is produced, though, and your wildfire activity. So the reason I say that is because I've seen this on numerous fires where in the morning I might be forecasting 80 degrees, 25 mile per hour winds, 17% relative humidity. But then the inversion, for whatever reason, just stays put throughout the... Actually, there is a reason that it stays put throughout the entire day. So normally your inversions will lift out in the afternoon because sunlight comes in, starts doing that heating effect. It leads to the winds going upslope in the afternoon, starts mixing things around a bit. But occasionally you can actually have so much smoke that you don't have as much sunlight hitting the surface. And then because you don't end up with these temperature differences, you end up having less wind, which doesn't push the smoke around. So summarizing that in a sentence, because I think that was a little more confusing than it needed to be. If you have a lot of smoke over an area, sunlight can't get in. So your temperatures, instead of being 80, might be 65. Instead of your winds being 25, they might be 10 mile per hour winds. Relative humidity, because the air is cooler, instead of being 17%, might be 35%. So your wildfire day ends up being a lot less active. And I've seen this happen on numerous fires in the past where I'm expecting very active wildfire conditions, but then that smoke inversion, for whatever reason, I haven't gotten great at forecasting this just yet, but for whatever reason, it'll stay put and wildfire activity will basically be non-existent for that day. But you do have worse air quality conditions when that does happen. So a little bit of a trade-off right there. So that, I'd say, summarizes where smoke is produced, how it's transported, some of the worst times that you would have smoke, and then some of the worst areas that you could have smoke, valley bottoms with low winds, especially in the morning when you have an inversion. But so far I've been talking a lot about just humans, but smoke does have impacts on plants as well. So one thing that I was saying is it can increase greenhouse gases, which increases the warming, and then obviously that's going to have impacts on your plants. It can also deposit a lot more nitrogen into your soils. And I always thought of that as a good thing. Oh, more nitrogen, that's more nutrients for your plants. Your plants could grow stronger. But apparently it can also be a bad thing in California because some of your nitrogen limited soils are more favorable to the species that have been living and surviving in California for hundreds of years. And then if you bring in a bunch of nitrogen from all your smoke, depositing it, then invasive species have a better ability to kind of invade, you could say. Invasive species invading. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. So that's maybe some downsides right there, but there's also some cool things that happen with plants and smoke. A lot of plants will start to germinate when smoke comes into the area. So it's almost like a trigger for germination. I'd imagine that has to do with if a fire has cleared out a lot of vegetation, that reduces your competition. So then it would be a good time for new seeds to germinate, for new plants to grow, just because there's less competition out there. I believe there's some animals and insects that respond to smoke as well. I'm going back, maybe I read about this 6 months ago in a textbook. I think there's something called the fire beetle, that when it smells smoke, it goes into that area and I believe it mates and then lays its eggs within the burning logs. And it really likes that high temperature within the burning logs. And that's part of its reproductive cycle. Now, one interesting thing is, I believe these are common in Southern California, like in the Chaparral area. But during, I think it was USC football games, people would be tailgating and there'd be so much smoke being produced at the tailgate that there'd be an infestation of fire beetles that usually will latch on to burning twigs and branches, but if they can't find that, then they've been known to latch on to people. So you'd have a bunch of people tailgating for a football game. Smoke is produced, it's a signal and a trigger for the fire beetle to start reproducing, and then you just get a swarm of beetles around your nice tailgate. I always thought that was kind of a funny story there. Now, the last thing that I read about in this textbook that I thought was pretty interesting is it said that the smoke produced by prescribed burning, because it has the pollutants that I talked about, CO2, methane, nitrogen oxides, VOCs, particulate matter, because that is technically humans putting fire on the ground on purpose, creating smoke on purpose, which has pollutants, and then that mixes into an area and creates bad air quality, that is considered as part of our air quality and maybe EPA restrictions for what we can do. Now, I do think this is interesting, though, because if you don't do the prescribed burning and you don't clear out some of the fuels, then those fuels are just going to continue to accumulate, and then eventually you're going to have a wildfire come through that leads to a lot more smoke than maybe what you would have had in the prescribed burn under more controlled conditions. Maybe you pick a day where you have a nice breeze where the winds would be blowing the smoke away from your major city. So it just seems to me like it would be better to produce as much smoke as possible during those prescribed burning events, because that means we're clearing out a lot of fuels, because we could pick and choose the days that we want to do it. So there's less threat to communities from a wildfire standpoint, but then also maybe less of an impact to people in terms of unhealthy air quality, because we could perhaps choose the days where we have favorable wind or something. And it seems weird to just regulate that as producing air pollution, because in a way you're also reducing air pollution in the future. So you might be producing a little air pollution now, but you're at least not kicking the can down the road. This actually, I think I'll wrap it up with a story, because just about 2 weeks ago in Santa Cruz County, they've been doing a bunch of prescribed burns up there. And I heard a lot of people complaining about the smoke and the poor air quality. And I do understand that, because obviously if it's October, it's some beautiful weather out there, you want to be doing things outside, but then now there's smoke, so then you can't, I don't know, go play pickleball or tennis or go surfing. But we do have to remember that the smoke we were feeling 2 weeks ago in Santa Cruz wasn't that much smoke. We did have a few periods where it got into that unhealthy to even hazardous category, but it was a lot less smoke than if we just kicked the can down the road. Maybe 3 years, those fuels continue to accumulate, and then there's some day where there's much more extreme wildfire conditions, a fire goes through and then burns everything in that area, and a lot more smoke is produced with a lot worse air quality. So it just comes back to that old question of, would you rather maybe sacrifice in the present for what's good in the long run, or would you rather kind of do what's maybe easiest in the present and then kick the can down the road and maybe make things worse in the long run, and make things worse in the long run than they would have needed to be if you had just dealt with it in the short run? So I'm always more in the camp of deal with things as soon as possible, because problems tend to get bigger and they tend to accumulate as you push them further off in time. So yeah, that's something that I've just been learning about throughout this textbook. That does wrap up chapter 7. Maybe I'll do another summary video on chapter 7 tomorrow, just with some of the key lessons I learned, tying the entire chapter together. If you want to stay tuned for that, I'll put that video out tomorrow, and thanks for watching.